Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this session. We're just a few more participants are trickling in, so we really appreciate the time. I will start off with a bit of scene setting before we jump off. Again, I really appreciate the support and your time, and I will run us through the entire agenda before we start. We have a really impressive set of participants, and I really think you'll get a lot out of the event. So just to start, ladies, gentlemen, all esteemed guests, and the press in the house, with great enthusiasm and pleasure, I extend a very warm welcome to the inaugural GEAPP Climate Africa Warsha. My name, as you see on the screen, is Jabri. I'm a Kenyan, and I work in service of the two UN climate change high-level champions for COP28 and now for this year for COP29. As you all may be well aware, today is World Press Freedom Day. So I want to take this time to appreciate the journalists in the house, in the audience, and the journalists in the panel for the crucial work you do. This year, the theme is dedicated to the importance of journalism and the freedom of expression within a specific context of the three planetary crises we face: the nature and biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, and the climate crisis, and how obviously you can effectively and perhaps more importantly, freely report on the crisis. Climate change makes floods and droughts worse. Any Kenyan can attest to this. It makes the planet warmer. You can ask the Ministry of Health in South Sudan about this, and it accelerates sea level rise. This comes to no surprise for the Gambians. Warsha, the name of our webinar, it's a Kiswahili and it's an Arabic term for workshop, and we hope to have a super interactive session with a lot of audience participation. So I hope you'll be listening keenly and prepare questions. We not only ask that, but we also have a survey at the end to solicit your feedback that will inform the work going forward. So we are really appreciating the time, and we want to honor your attendance by taking your feedback forward. We have about 100 registered participants, 25 different countries across the world, and we feel a great sense of privilege that GEAPP has convened us today as we launch as we start this important journey and that aims to reshape the narrative on climate discourse as well as renewable energy in Africa. GEAPP, as you may already know, stands at the forefront of fostering this transformative change across the continent. And we're launching this initiative, the Climate Africa Warsha, that is designed to equip you as journalists with the insights and the support you may need to elevate renewable energy discourse as well as climate change reporting to the highest level of general public discourse. And we want to be in service to you, to be useful to you in the important work you do on a day-to-day basis. And we view this initiative as an equal partnership with journalists, yourselves, and the media, and recognize your pivotal role in shaping public discourse on climate and renewable energy, those two agendas. We'll kick off with an overview of climate journalism's significance, and then there's a keynote by a very esteemed honorable speaker that I don't want to spoil the surprise, and then a panel discussion on Africa's role in achieving a very specific renewable energy goal, obviously the tripling and doubling pledge that we've seen that has been endorsed at COP28. And following the panel, we'll have a Q&A session with the panelists before doing a few interactive workshops on different types of reporting techniques and data usage. And then you'll gather your feedback at the end. So just to have that in mind as we go, as we engage in this process as equal participants, we'll have just a few. I want to go through a few house rules. There'll be a time for questions after the panel. You'll put that in the chat box. We'll be fielding them. And we are also going to have a few prompts at the end for your responses and a survey at the end. So please feel free to use the chat box for that important Q&A session, as well as look out for the survey at the end. It's a very short survey. It might take some of you just 30 seconds, but for us, it's really important. So with that said, I want to now, very honored to kickstart the session and welcome Annette Mutuku, who is my good friend and who also happens to be the Director of Communications in Africa at GEAPP, and who will provide an overview of the GEAPP African Climate Journalism Academy. Thank you all so much, and Annette, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jabri, for that warm introduction and also for taking us through this important day. I just want to celebrate all the journalists that are in the house today. So actually, we had over 150 journalists from across 25 countries register for this session. So we truly appreciate you honoring us with your presence on this important day. And what are the odds that this year's theme could be focusing on the climate action agenda? I was just thinking earlier in my career days, before I chose my subjects in the university, I wanted to be a journalist, but I ended up in PR. And so in my day-to-day work, I work a lot with journalists from across Africa and also globally. So very happy to be hosting all of you. Jabri has talked a bit about GEAPP, and I don't want to bore you with who we are, what we do, and just to set a bit of context, and it will explain why we thought about starting this platform. GEAPP was launched in 2021 to sort of address the defining dual challenge of our lifetime. Our current challenge is actually to end the energy poverty, but also to tackle the climate crisis through a just energy transition across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, just generally the emerging markets. And one of the things, being an alliance, one of the things we recognize is that this cannot be done by one organization, by one country, or one individual. And so we recognize the role the media has to play, the role the philanthropists like ourselves have to play, the role the government has to play for us, to make this work. And just as Jabri was saying, from COP28 last year in Dubai and the just ended global stock tech, it's clear that we are not moving, as far as we would want to be towards the goal of keeping our warming limits to 1.5 C. But then what can we do? And most of you were part of the Africa Climate Summit last year. And what the Africa Climate Summit sought to do, the important takeaway from that was, changing the narrative, Africa's narrative, and positioning Africa not just as a victim in climate impact, but a key player, because we have resources, we have something to put on the table. We are not just begging. And so we hope that through this Warsha, we are going to bring together our resources, us from the philanthropy side, from the renewable energy side, from the multilaterals, from the governments, and bring our resources together to be able to push this narrative further. And so since I joined GEAPP the first day for the Africa Climate Summit. And one of the things that we kept on talking about, and Mimi is also on this call, and she led the communication for the Africa Climate Summit, is how can we partner with like-minded organizations to help our journalists tell the story better. We could be doing amazing things. Africa could be moving the needle as far as these agendas are concerned, but if we don't equip the media, we are not going to do so much, and our story will not be heard. And so this platform we launched today, it's not just because today is the International World Press Day. We've been talking about this for a while. We plan to have this quarterly, a platform where we can bring media and the other stakeholders to discuss not just ideas, but also to identify what are some of the resources we need to put together to help shape this narrative and give it legs, Africa's narrative towards climate action. And so the bigger picture of this is to have a proper climate energy journalist academy. But as we say, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. And so today, I want to thank each one of you for joining us in making the first step. And we are relying on you a lot to get feedback on how we can build this and sustain it so that all of us can benefit and we can make Africa shine. Thank you so much. Back to you, Jabri.
Thank you so much, Annette. Really exciting stuff, and I really appreciate your insight into this. As Annette rightly put, for GEAPP aims to tackle the just energy transition in the global south, which is important because that's the focus on the energy transition, and a big part of the justice and equity part falls predominantly on the global south. And GEAPP also recognizes the role of every actor in society and are committed to an inclusive multi-stakeholder approach. And obviously that a big part of that inclusive approach includes you, the press and the media. And Annette, we are looking so much forward to the inception and the build out of the academy. And I'm personally just following up on this. So keen to hear the next steps. With that, I will now very swiftly move on to another section of the program that I'm personally very honored to be in a position to introduce. And as we take a deeper look into the significance of climate journalism, renewable energy, and climate discourse in Africa in general, it is an absolute honor to welcome to the virtual stage our keynote speaker, His Excellency, the immediate former Vice President of Nigeria and the Global Advisor for the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, Professor Yemi Osinbajo. Professor, I just want to welcome you to the stage and just to introduce your section. It would be great if you can share with the audience and obviously other panel members your expertise on the significance of climate journalism, and perhaps, Professor, you could also reflect on your personal experience interacting with the press and the role of the press in Nigeria during your tenure and in the continent at large. So with that, I'm very honored to pass to you.
Thank you very much, Jabri, thank you. Let me say that I'm very honored to have been asked to speak to this very distinguished audience of journalists, communication experts, and of course, several friends and colleagues who are interested in the energy transition journey, especially in Africa. And I welcome you also to this GEAPP Climate Africa Warsha. And if, like me, you were wondering what a warsha is, I think Jabri has explained to us, as actually a Swahili word for seminar or workshop or specialized or advanced training. And I think the timing is excellent. The timing of this warsha is excellent. Today is World Press Freedom Day, and the theme, a press for the planet, journalism in the face of environmental crisis, recognizes one of the most important global concerns in our generation, which is the climate crisis and the energy transition, and the very crucial role that the press as interlocutors, as explainers, and as interrogators of the global journey to net zero have. And I must commend GEAPP for this convening, but more importantly, its leadership in driving green energy initiatives across Africa and, of course, across the world. By bringing together governments, the private sector, and communities, GEAPP is catalyzing transformative change that promises prosperity, innovation, and sustainable livelihoods for all. I think the press in Africa has been that one institution that had been in the forefront of practically every significant battle that the peoples of our continent have fought, whether it is decolonization or human rights or civil, or the struggle for civil and political rights, or even epidemics. The press in Africa has always literally been at the barricades, especially because its own origins and raison d'etre are grounded in freedom and egalitarianism. But I must say that despite the existential nature of the climate crisis, we have not seen the same enthusiasm or sustained focus that we've seen around previous battles that the press has fought around the climate crisis. Perhaps this is because of the way the core issues in the climate crisis have been framed, and they've been framed mostly around technical themes. But there have been some excellent work done, and I think we must applaud several friends and colleagues who are here. For example, Zainab Wandati, who I believe is present here today, and many others who have paved the way with award-winning stories that have shifted conversations in Africa's sustainability, energy, and the climate space. So one of the crucial challenges that I'm going to be throwing to you today is, how can we frame the issues that directly concern Africa in the climate crisis correctly? How can we frame those issues correctly? The issues around fighting energy poverty, for example, and its wider implications for extreme poverty. Why is it that greening industry or greening energy in Africa is crucial for global ambitions for net zero? Why is it important that Africa's own transition process, Africa's own greening process, is crucial for the net zero ambitions of the world? How do we attain a just, equitable, and inclusive energy transition? How can we challenge governments, institutions, the private and non-governmental sectors to be a strong part of Africa's pivotal role in the green energy journey and achieving the global goal of tripling energy capacity and doubling efficiency by 2030? We all know that Africa is the least emitter of the dangerous gases that cause the climate crisis. But Africa is warming faster than any other continent. We're experiencing the extreme consequences of climate change: flooding, drought, excessive heat, rising sea levels, and we're probably the least equipped planet to deal with the devastation of the crisis. We all know that the major cause of the climate crisis is emission of greenhouse gases, mostly from fossil fuels, and that fossil fuels have been the major source of generation of power and electricity. The wealthiest countries in the world have used fossil fuels to develop their own economies, and this has resulted in the climate crisis. But African countries have a dilemma. We need more power, we need more electricity, but we are energy poor. Over 600 million Africans have no access to electricity. Another 150 million have irregular access. So this means that the lack of electricity for cooking, industry, small businesses, cooling, etc., have contributed in no small part to the general poverty on our continent. Now, this is one of the main reasons why economic growth and job creation are slow, and we have the huge problem of extreme poverty. So unlike the developed world that is only battling with the climate crisis, Africa has a twin crisis. We're also battling with lack of energy or energy poverty. Now that introduces a very difficult question. If Africa wants to develop like the wealthier countries of the world, then we must use the same carbon-intensive methods that they used. In other words, we would be using fossil fuels, we'll be using coal, we'll be using oil and gas, etc. But if we do so, and we grow to upper middle income status with the same carbon intensity as current countries in that income bracket, we will be adding 9 gigatons of CO2e annually and by 2050, we would have become responsible for 75% of global emissions. We would be the world's worst polluters as of 2050. And I just want to explain this. I just want to explain this a bit more. The point I'm making is that if Africa were to develop the same way that the wealthier countries of the world have developed, and we move to middle to high income status in the same way that they have developed, using fossil fuels to develop, using dangerous gases to develop. We would be pumping into the atmosphere 9 gigatons of greenhouse gases annually. By 2050, we would become responsible for 75% of global emissions. So one thing is certain: if we go the way the rest of the world has grown to develop, if we are to develop in the same way that the wealthy countries of the world have developed, it will be impossible for the world to achieve net zero by 2050. So Africa can be the nemesis of the world or the solution to the climate crisis. We can either be the nemesis of the world, or we can be the solution to the climate crisis. Africa can be the solution if we pursue a climate positive or carbon negative pathway to growth. And to quote a popular American politician, yes, we can. Africa is home to 40% of the world's best solar resources. And in addition, we have abundant wind, geothermal, and hydro potential. Africa's untapped renewable energy potential is 50 times the anticipated global demand for electricity in 2040. In addition, Africa has 30% of the critical minerals and other natural resources that the world requires, and the youngest and the largest workforce in the world. So we can become the world's first truly green industrial civilization, and in the process, create millions of jobs and opportunities for our people. Indeed, we are the best positioned to contribute to achieving the global goal of tripling renewable energy and doubling energy efficiency by 2030. But the wealthier world has to recognize the sacrifice that Africa is making by not pursuing the same carbon-intensive pathway by which they developed. And this is why we emphasize the notion of a just energy transition. A just energy transition, a transition that recognizes the individual contributions of all parties. A transition that recognizes Africa's forbearance by not using fossil fuels, and that forbearance ought to come with some forms of compensations, but we're not asking for handouts. We're asking for investments. The transition from the use of fossil fuels and other pollutants to develop the use of clean energy requires certain types of investments. Already we know that Africa bears the brunt of the burden of the climate crisis, but we're also going to be guinea pigs for climate positive growth. And there are, I think, 2 ways by which wealthy countries can support. The first is investment in renewable energy in Africa. And we won't have time to look at all the dimensions of that. The second is opening up markets for green products coming from Africa. And of course, carbon markets, enabling carbon markets in Africa, enabling carbon credits in Africa to be sold internationally and to be sold at a fair price. Again, we won't have time to go into all of the detail of that. But I've laid this background of where we are to enable you as communications experts, as journalists, and as practitioners in this field to appreciate some of the real issues in the climate crisis and the energy transition journey, especially as they concern Africa and African countries. So you have to be not just the chroniclers, but also the catalysts of many aspects of the energy transition journey. Climate change, as most of us know, is full of jargon and technicalities, and is sometimes even difficult for policymakers to fully understand. Well, I think it's the business of journalists and communications experts to simplify the issues and make them accessible to everyone, not just the experts. For example, why do we insist on a just transition? Just as an example of one of the issues that would arise and that would expect some contributions and some analysis from our media experts. Germany, one of the most developed economies in the world, has about 248,000 megawatts of power for its 68 million people. Africa's 1.3 billion people have an installed capacity of only 244,000 megawatts. So, to grow our power using only renewable energy, we must have substantial investments from the wealthier countries. I think it's the role of communications experts and journalists to give life to the stories behind the statistics, and there are loads of statistics. The real women and children who suffer death and illness on account of using firewood and kerosene for cooking. You must hold governments to account about policies for increasing investments in renewable energy. How much are they walking the talk? About what? And we must also hold governments accountable for what they're doing about climate positive growth and the great opportunities that this paradigm offers. September last year at the Africa Climate Summit, the African Union, African countries agreed on this pathway of climate positive growth. So you'll find it in the Nairobi Declaration. All African countries agree that we must pursue the paradigm of climate positive growth or carbon negative growth, using mainly renewable energy in our development. So we must ask the question, how many are walking the talk? For example, credible studies show, and if we walk the talk, we can solve the problem and we can create jobs and opportunities in the process. For example, very credible studies show that by aggressively deploying its renewable energy resources, Africa can actually provide for all of the 600 million of our people who currently do not have access to energy, and the 150 million who have unreliable access to energy, at a 30% lower cost and over 90% lower emissions per kilowatt hour compared to the current stated policy. So by using renewable energy, by using our resources, we can actually solve the problem much cheaper and with far lower emissions. Indeed, Africa's renewable energy is not only abundant, not only do we have abundant renewable energy, but our renewable energy also has very low seasonality or intermittency, which makes it possible to reliably provide renewable baseload to power continuous industrial production. And let me just explain that a bit. Our sunshine, for example, is not intermittent as it is in other places. We have sunshine for much longer hours than any other continent in the world, and that's evident. And that's why we say that our renewable energy has very low seasonality and also low intermittency. So it's possible to use it continuously. And with a sort of battery storage technology that's available today, it's possible to use it for even longer periods. So we're in the best position to use renewable energy. And strikingly also, the lowest cost setup of solar, wind, and battery storage to get reliable baseload in order to power industry is twice as expensive in, for example, Germany as it is in Nigeria. Solar PVs in Nigeria and in Kenya, for example, vastly outperform Europe's industry center and even Europe's top PV spots. So the solar PVs in Nigeria or Kenya, the same battery-supported PV system, for example, in Nigeria, will enable a base load that is 8 times as large as Germany. In Spain, 1.8 times larger. So we must tell these compelling stories. And these things will encourage not just our governments, but also investors to see Africa as the right place to invest, especially in renewable energy. And we must tell the stories of collaborative work being done by governments, by private sector, and non-governmental entities to deploy renewable energy more effectively. GEAPP has done and is doing extensive work on battery energy storage systems to expand the capacity of renewable energy sources. They're also working on distributed renewable energy, deploying mini grids in places that once had no power, and also doing some incredible miracles in irrigation using distributed renewable energy. The narratives of Africa as a victim of climate change is true. The narratives are true, but that's a small part of the story. Africa is also the new powerhouse of the world with its abundance of renewable energy sources. And Africa might well hold the balance if the world is to avoid the looming climate disaster. So I think on our part, on part of communications experts and journalists, we must seek to attain critical mass in numbers and in the efforts in climate journalism, especially regarding the crucial role that journalists must play in informing, in communicating, in challenging, and in catalyzing policy and implementation of Africa's green energy initiatives. Today, there are so many platforms for communication and information, and a wide variety of genres as well. Cartoons and photographs, for example, have been shown to attract far more attention than prose. Very few people pay attention to graphs and statistics, and it really doesn't matter how important the information in those graphs and statistics are. People just don't like statistics very much, or graphs. And there are probably plenty of them in the climate change discourse. A new study by the University of Wisconsin and Eco Agricultural Partners found that using art, using cartoons, for example, to convey environmental data eased political perceptions about climate change. So humanizing data is important. And I think that this is a special role that journalists, especially those especially cartoonists and those who depict information in graphics can deploy to great effect. So ladies and gentlemen, given the existential nature of the environmental crisis, especially for Africa, we certainly need a press for the planet. Journalism must literally come to the rescue. And you are the credible, informed, patriotic storytellers of Africa's historic journey to becoming the world's first truly green civilization. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm sending you a virtual clapping right now. I really appreciated your insight, and I couldn't agree more. Just to reflect on some of the insight you offered, I couldn't agree more on what you said on the important role of the press in the struggle for civil and political rights in decolonization, of course, during the pandemic, and for enhanced democracy. And we hope this role of the press and this interest from the press continues in climate issues in Africa, so that we obviously write our own story, our own climate story, and we frame our own narrative. And just to conclude, I also want to thank you for outlining the dilemma in Africa that exists, especially in development in energy transition and in power generation, especially traditional fossil-derived electricity generation, and that future potential that the continent can generate in terms of emissions, the 75% of global emissions. And I have also been working on this space, and I like your point around the market access for green African commodities so that we could leverage our three advantages. renewable energy potential, 40% in the world, and the critical mineral endowment, and obviously our very talented youth population. So with that, thank you once more, Professor Osinbajo, for your insight, your sage advice, your guidance, and the important work in outlining the important work that the press do in Africa, and that cannot be understated. They play a vital role in any modern society. And your words truly inspire us to come together to tackle the climate challenges facing our continent. And we appreciate your continued leadership in this space. Thank you. With that, I think we are running a bit behind schedule. So I just quickly set the scene before now introducing our panel discussion. And just to frame it, this will be discussing the global target as outlined, as endorsed at COP28, but even before that, so that I set the scene before the panel dissects it. So Africa, our continent, has the potential to contribute to the global target of tripling renewable capacity and doubling efficiency by 2030. Africa, as everyone might know on the call, but if not, you will at least leave the webinar knowing it. The continent has 40% of all renewable energy potential in the world. So we have 40% of that, but that has never materialized to any real investment in the sector. Africa estimates outline that Africa only gets about 2% of renewable energy or clean power investment. And you juxtapose that against the 40% of potential, it doesn't make any investment sense. So there's a bit of a justice equity element here as well. And that this urgent call to ramp up to that global target was first presented in a Reuters report. So that outlines obviously the role of the press. And it was then presented to COP28 last year in Dubai, providing both the private sector and member states to the COP process with policy recommendations that are actionable. And that report for the pledge outlined the urgent need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We're currently at 1.2 degrees, and we've seen what's happening in terms of weather events and climate shocks. So we need to do the best to avoid as much disastrous climate effects as possible. And obviously governments play a huge role in this, as well as the private sector. And it's imperative that we communicate this need and urgency. The renewable energy capacity needs to reach a minimum of 11,000 gigawatts, while simultaneously doubling the energy efficiency improvement in the grid, in appliances, in other end users. So this report from Reuters was endorsed, as I said, by the COP28 presidency via a pledge. The pledge is called the Global Renewables and Energy Efficiency Pledge, one of the outcomes of COP28, and 125 countries signed up to it, not only in Africa, across the globe. So now there's an imperative to deliver now on the pledge to triple generation capacity, and to double efficiency 6 years down the line. To 2030. Something I wanted to mention, and I was discussing before we set up this webinar, is that the International Energy Agency that Kenya and a few other African nations are member states to, the IEA, at the request of governments in Dubai at COP28, is going to now work with the UN FCCC, the UN climate change body, to track progress for any energy-related pledges made at COP28. So this obviously will support that full timely implementation of the promises made in energy at Dubai, but also identify pathways for policy making on accelerating national and secure clean energy transition. But it's also now prudent, if the press wants to track progress of the pledges made on energy, there's an online portal by the International Energy Agency that is tracking progress. So it could obviously be used as a tool to help your work on disseminating this and tracking progress and holding power to account. And just to conclude, I think what the Professor Osinbajo rightly mentioned is, and I agree with, is that the goal of doubling and tripling generation, doubling efficiency, it needs to also deliver on African needs and priorities, like the 650 million Africans that have no form of energy access, no fossil access, no renewable energy access to both electricity and clean cooking. And this is an absolute imperative to address for this pledge. And the tripling and doubling can't only be channeled, basically any new generation can't only be channeled to high cost, energy intensive, profitable industry, but it also has to improve access outcomes to rural communities in Africa. So that's the equity and the climate justice discourse we're having here. So with that in mind, I just want to really now quickly introduce the panel. The panel is on Africa's role in the global goal of tripling renewable capacity and doubling efficiency by 2030. Our panel is a myriad of different types of stakeholders: government, advocacy, philanthropy, funders, and obviously a member of the press. And they each bring a unique perspective to the table. And their work includes everything from policy work, funding, holding power to account, advocacy, etc. And we hope this session brings insights and expertise. Actually, the session promises to bring insights and expertise on advancing sustainable energy across the continent. I welcome to the virtual stage now from GEAPP, McKenna Ireri, Director of Demand, Jobs, Livelihoods at GEAPP. From Power Africa, Phoebe Sullivan. From the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission, Blessing Manale, Head of Communications and Social Engagement. Our very own John Alanamu, CEO, co-founder of the Africa Uncensored and a member of the Reuters Institute's Advisory Board. And last but truly not least, from our esteemed advocacy stakeholder group, Adenika Oladosu, who's a Nigerian climate activist and the initiator and the founder of the Schools Track for Climate in Nigeria, representing a major part of the climate movement, the African youth movement in the continent. So panelists, I just before we start and I pose the questions to you, I want to say that you have more than one opportunity to address the audience. So I'll ask a question, I'll come back to you. So I kindly ask you to keep your responses as short as possible so that I can manage some of the time here. And participants, you'll be hearing from the panel now. So please ask, keep an ear out, ask a specific question to the panel, and we'll be able to address some of them at the end. Our tech team is managing this process and scoping it. Thank you all. Let me just check. Okay, I have my panel here with me. Thank you all so much. Maybe, I'm sat at the GEAPP offices, so maybe I start with McKenna to ask you your first question and to also welcome you to, address the participants. So I've just talked about the doubling, the tripling pledge. I want to ask from the perspective of GEAPP and philanthropy, what specific solutions, projects, on-the-ground projects is GEAPP undertaking and supporting to help achieve that goal? And what has been some of the impact? But also, when you respond, it should be good to also not only share the success story, which is important, but maybe some of the blockages and how we address those. So with that, McKenna, I'll pass to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabril, and thank you all for joining us. Excited to be here to participate in this. So when you talk about the solutions that GEAPP is pursuing, and in a wider sense, philanthropy, for us, they sit under three buckets. First, it's distributed renewable energy, because if we're going to double renewable energy on the continent, it will not all be on the grid. There are limitations to that, and there are people who are outside the grid who also are without energy access, as we had the professor describe so eloquently. So distributed renewables are going to be a solution and must be part of the solution. So we support countries to increase their share of these distributed renewables. Think of them as mini grids or even the solar home systems that you can sometimes even find in the shop. And for example, here in Nigeria, we've helped the utility figure out a way to interconnect mini grids with existing grids to support it. I think power issues and concerns around fossil fuel-based power production in Nigeria are not new to a lot of us, but in solutions like this, you can really accelerate the increase of renewable energy and help it already tied to existing systems, but also serve who are those who are in need. We also go beyond just the production of energy, because energy for energy's sake doesn't really support all the development ambitions that the African continent has. So apart from just delivering energy, we want to make sure that it's productive. So our other solutions are, how do we make that energy work for people? How do we make it so that it's able to help them realize the economic benefits, to help them be resilient against the changing climate, and also to kind of improve their well-being and livelihoods. So when I talk about productive uses, an example I could give, for example, is in Ethiopia, where we have the DREAM project. So this brings together distributed renewable energy with irrigation and does that at a farmer level, so that a lot of farmers who are facing changing weather conditions because of a changing climate are able to be resilient because they have water to irrigate their crops. So yes, the energy is provided, but then the use of that energy becomes completely important. And finally, one of the solutions we are really pursuing and are excited about, it's battery energy storage solutions. You can, if you pump a lot of renewables into the grid, as many countries have done and have found out, they can have potential to destabilize the grid. You need to balance that out. You need to be able to store energy, to release it when it's needed, and be able to distribute it effectively across countries. So for example, in Malawi, we are commissioning the first battery energy storage solution in Malawi. It's kind of a flagship project on this solution, and it's really to help balance out the grid there, increase the penetration of renewable energy that Malawi is able to absorb and distribute effectively. So for us, these are the three things that we think are really exciting. And it's not that our impact, there's the impact in number of megawatts installed, and we can count all that. But it's really about people. It's about the family in Nigeria that is now able to access a fan to cool the environment when the temperatures in Nigeria reach levels that are uncomfortable, or that they can then do productive work. They can open their shop longer because, you know, they can withstand that environment. Really, that's the impact, and that's the reality of what increasing renewables, increasing energy efficiency across the continent can really bring.
Thank you so much, McKenna. I really appreciate how succinct and information-packed that was. Absolutely, people-centered approach is also what my organization has been asking for, and the productive use for DRE that gives African communities what they actually want: electrification, productivity, development, etc. So thank you for that. John, maybe I can go to you next. Thank you for joining us. And I think I can speak for a number of Kenyans, but maybe just my parents. You're truly an inspiration for the country. The work you do is so important with your investigative journalism stuff. And we recently, with your documentary, if I can mention it, Fertile Deception, and the work you've been doing in holding certain power to account is so crucial. So I wanted to obviously recognize that first, but to also get your point of view and a perspective on this discussion we're having here. And primarily the role of maybe yourself and media at large in monitoring pledges that, you know, our countries go to this summits, they make pledges, and how do we monitor that to hold to account some of the companies, the countries that make pledges, like, you know, doubling and tripling capacity? Because as I said, at COP28, 125 countries signed up to the pledge. How can we ensure, how can the press basically help us to ensure to hold them to account and to deliver on the pledge? So with that, John, thanks for being here, and I'll pass to you now.
Thank you very much, Jabri. And thank you very much for hosting me on World Press Freedom Day, no less. It's an honor to be here. And also thank you very much for the comments that you made about the work that we're doing at Africa Uncensored. So when it comes to countries keeping pledges that have been made around climate justice, climate action, climate financing, I like to look at it more from the audience perspective, right? Because to our audiences, these pledges sometimes just sum up to numbers that are quite abstract, and there's no real sense of what the applications are for. So for instance, just to give an example, the president of the Republic of Kenya was asking for 16 trillion shillings in climate financing to help mitigate against the most harmful effects of climate change, etc. But that's an arbitrary number. And this is where I think the role of the media generally now, and I'm speaking about media more broadly than just journalists, But the role of the media here would be to give people an understanding of what the impact of these kinds of monies are, what the shortfalls actually represent in real tangible terms, and so that audiences can relate these numbers and these pledges to the experiences that they're having on the ground in a very real and connected way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think even more crucial to the whole climate change discussion, even aside from looking at pledges, it is that understanding of the system. And I was talking about this yesterday on a similar panel about some of the systemic issues that impact how climate change is perceived, what advances can be made with respect to mitigating against the harmful impacts of climate change, and getting real buy-in from members of the public on this. And to me, as an investigative journalist, it really starts there. It starts with helping people see the system, right? And see, if I'm to drill down as an example here, what the carbon credit market looks like. Why, for instance, countries in the global south are becoming destinations for the purchase of carbon credits. Is that carbon credit market fair? Do carbon credits, even as a scientific concept, actually work? And now apply that to what people's lived experiences are on the ground, right? People have the experience of their own eyes to tell you what the impacts of climate change are. And they would therefore be much more ready. I think they'd much more readily connect to subject matter on climate change if they understood where they fit in that whole tapestry, in that whole system. I think the final thing that I will say, and I apologize, my thoughts are a bit too brief on this. The final thing that I will say about pledges is I think journalists really need to attack this issue of pledges from reporting on the geopolitics around why pledges aren't working or haven't worked in the past, right? Because if we were to look back to one specific COP, Paris, right? The US just walked out of that deal, and there was no accountability. There was nothing that could be done. And when these larger and specifically larger polluter nations walk out of these kinds of deals and these kinds of pledges, or do not commit fully, then it leaves countries that are suffering the worst impacts of climate change kind of twisting in the wind and at a disadvantage, because if Kenya is one of the 7 out of the 10 countries where we're experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change. Add on to that a global financing infrastructure that limits access to monies for investment in infrastructure, raising capital for jobs, being able to create connected markets in Africa, trying to create the kind of environment where an African can actually do better financially in their lives and start then to also focus more on these existential challenges. That leaves countries and individuals like that twisting in the wind. And so this is where the province of journalism sort of rests. It's in not just talking about the events and talking about the signatories and the signatures that have been appended to any pledges, but giving that context in what that truly means. And with the absence of these kinds of countries at the table, what the impact of that would then mean at a granular level, at a community level, then at a national and possibly even a continental level. I think I'll stop there and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, John. I couldn't agree more, especially around what just concluded with around the discussion can inherently, the way it exists, prevent a lot of people from engaging with it, either too technical or, you first have to address real issues in your day-to-day before then conceptualizing and thinking about how to address such existential global issues. And also, I think the work on getting buy-in on some of the emerging issues, including on carbon credit fairness, and does the robust science, even what robust science has to say about the carbon credit market is so important. And I think that ties it well to what maybe I was going to ask Adenike, to you, because I think what the work you do is also related and it ties in with what the press does and what John does. So it would be good to hear from you, and it's a good flow of discussion if also we can get your perspective on the role of civil society advocacy in promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency policies initiatives in Africa. And what do you see the role of this pledge? How can it deliver for African peoples? So over to you, Adenike. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much. I'm happy to be invited. And I'm also happy that journalists are also included in this because they're also very important in trying to, salvage this kind of issue, to expose where we need to do more and what we are also doing currently so that we could be able to bridge those gaps on energy demand. As we know that Africa needs a lot of energy, talking about the facts from reports from International Energy Agency that talked about their outlook, their 2022 outlooks, the African part of it. It talked about the fact that 76% of electricity that we need in Africa is going to come from renewable by 2050. And so we have to start from now. We can't wait until when 2050 comes before we do the necessary actions. And the report further stated the fact that we also need about $100 billion annually for us to be able to meet up with our energy demand. And all of this energy demand, it requires us to be able to do something about it. And the role of civil society is to be able to bring this issue to the forefront of the people, because we are also part of the society. And so it's to be able to bring the forefront of the society demands or needs for people to understand. For example, when I go for community outreach or advocacy, one of those issues that people are faced with, especially people from the grassroots, is the fact that they want to transit. They don't want to use the coal, the firewood. They're also eager to be able to key into the renewable sector. But then it is not affordable. For people that can't afford one-day meal, it's not affordable to get renewable energy like solar. So it's now rests on the civil society to be able to bring the demands to the people or to the government to see, to be able to know the needs of the people. And how do we make this possible? It's for us to be able to suggest to the government on the aspect of, okay, why can't we subsidize renewable energy for people to be able to afford it everywhere and anywhere? Because today we could see that the fossil fuel is subsidized, and that is why people are able to get it. But if we could do the same thing for renewable energy, it could help to be able to enable people to acquire it. I was also speaking with someone in Nigeria, because I am from Nigeria, yesterday, talking about the energy demands, that we now have fuel scarcity, and at the same time, the subsidy for fuel as removed. And so what do we need to do next? And the person was telling me about the fact that renewable is good, but then the amount that they need to get this renewable energy is much. It could cost millions of naira in Nigeria currency. And so there are opportunities that we could harness in the renewable sector, but are those opportunities available? And so that is where the civil society comes on board to tell the government what they could do, where the gaps lies, and what they could do to improve renewable energy for all, because we need renewable energy. Nigeria has that capacity. Africa as a whole has the capacity that the world needs when it comes to terms of renewable energy. What we need is more investment, and that is what the civil society is also telling the government. We need to invest more on renewable energy. Just like we heard from Professor Yemi Oshibanjo, he talked about the fact that we have a lot of sunshine in Africa or in Nigeria, we could harness that. We could also harness the power of wind energy at the same time to be able to drive the necessary solutions. And so civil society are trying to bring this issue to the forefront to know where we need to work on and where we don't need to do much work, and at the same time to also bring to the forefront the investments that we need in different society, and how our community are also being faced with energy poverty at the same time, and also how it could help to increase or improve business environments, that if we could have renewable energy and we have constant energy supply, it could also help business to flourish as it needed. And so a lot of concerns that civil society put together to bring to the forefront of the government, and to also serve as a middleman between the government and the community to be able to convey the issues or the problem at hand. So that is the aspect.
Thank you so much, Adenike. I want to quickly reflect, and then I want to pass on to you, Blessing, because Adenike has outlined really the role of public sector and government. But I like your perspective, Adenike, on energy as I understand it from your point of view as a right. And this is really hard, especially for private sector players, to grasp how this is not just any commodity. It really is the golden string that leads to development, and how, policy can address this from the public sector, can address this access affordability issues instead of only kind of a punitive policy approach. For instance, from increasing tariffs without public participation, without kind of really knowing what happens if you increase electricity tariffs in a country without, communicating this effectively or asking the opinions of the affected communities. So I appreciate your remarks. I want to say just one thing before Blessing, kind of housekeeping. Please, if you're asking any panelist a question in the chat box, please avoid it from being too general, and please address it to a specific panelist on a specific issue that they'll be able to respond to, and then we can go into the Q&A after. And we're running a bit behind schedule, but Blessing, really good to have you. Thank you for joining us. And I know you're, again, I want to introduce your title, the Head of Communications and Social Engagement at the PCC, the Presidential Climate Commission of the South African government. To really understand from you, how does the PCC collaborate with media outlets and journalists to communicate the climate-related policies and initiatives effectively to the public? And can you share some examples of successful partnerships between the PCC and media, and how that has led to increased awareness, engagement on climate issues among the audience in South Africa? Obviously, South Africa was the first pilot of the GEAPP process, but it's also one of signatories for this pledge. So keen to hear how this has gone from your experience. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, and good day, colleagues, and the Excellency in absentia. I must say, let me start by saying we should not be ashamed of calling this media workshop on the eve of World Press Freedom Day. And we must make it standard, because, the fourth estate, it's caught between an onslaught of both climate denialism and climate alarmism. So I think that we need to free ourselves from both and continue to remain true to the value of objectivity as the media. So I think it's correct that we are putting climate reporting and journalism at the core of press freedom, from influence and from all kind of information want. But from the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa, it's actually a multi-stakeholder body, and it came out, interestingly, not out of a climate negotiation, out of a job summit in South Africa, where workers said, addressing the energy trilemma, energy security, growth targets, and the climate crisis would require us to create a body that will facilitate our just transition to a net zero society. So we're not necessarily a state department, but the commission has got about 10 ministers and then about 25 social partners from what we generally call the major groups. And we're a fairly new commission, 3 years, but we have come into a space where there was this lack of trust between government, civil society felt that they were not being consulted, the South African media, and to a particular extent, the regional media in SADC was not grabbing the interconnection between climate and development. So one of the, and we had to also start saying, but we cannot just communicate and build capacity. What are the issues? And we understood that there was just no nexus between the issues I've raised. And we started by saying, is the problem in the newsroom? Yes, there are problems in the newsroom. The revenue is shrinking. The first salary to cut off would be for your climate journalist. You've got communities in transition being in the most rural areas. They don't have free data. They rely on community radio. So one of the interventions was to go and say, let's work with community radio. Let's bring in the producers. And we also had to start saying, even let's also address issues of misinformation. And we use some complex analytics to find out whether the era of digital media is not fueling some of these effects. But then I think also from a South African point of view, we've got a history of major campaigns. I mean, in the onslaught of tourism in South Africa, where I was head of communications before I joined the Climate Commission, we had tourist numbers dwindling in South Africa because there was this net zero water crisis in the Cape. There was this issue of South Africa being unsafe. And we just discovered that that was actually misinformation. And you had to go out and find out, why are people doing that? And we had to then start talking to the newsrooms, how to verify sources. But we've also, as the Presidential Climate Commission noted, that we need a major campaign in South Africa that rallies all of society behind a common consensus. So that those that are worried about jobs can feel that they are part of climate action. The communities that have got crisis of energy insecurity in the regions of Mpumalanga, you've got a region that has got 8 power stations, but the village does not have electricity. The workers go and work in those power stations and go back home without electricity. And we needed the media to cover that. But what we are, and I don't know how much time, I'm not watching my clock, but if I cut myself and speak short, I'll always come back with the questions. But we've done 2 major pieces of tools in South Africa. We have done with our Human Sciences Research Council what we call the State of Climate Awareness social attitudes. And that is a piece of work done by a credible research institute. And it shows us South Africans are worried about load shedding, but they're not, but they don't link load shedding with, when load shedding ends, they don't link it with new renewables coming into the stream. So you need to continue to link as journalists why one problem gets solved by the other. The second major piece of work, which we will launch on the 6th of June this year, it's what we call the Real State of Climate Action Report for the country. And it's a mixture of the science, the boring graphs, the information from the terminals on data, but also the information from communities expressing how they've benefited from the value cold chain, but how they cannot afford to cure their children dying from asthma. So that is the kind of tools that we want to use. And lastly, on finance, which is about doubling or even tripling Africa's output, I think we have, as South Africa, done what we call a climate finance landscape. And it shows where the money is coming from. The money continues to come from the public sector. But also, we've also, and as I close for now, I've been in the space for ages. I'm 51 years old. I was at the 1992 Rio Summit. I was at the Johannesburg Summit. I was in the Rio +20 Summit. I was head of communications for COP17. So we've seen these pledges come and go. And I think that the role of the media, don't ask about whether the pledge has been met on the 10th year, on year 1. On the policy year, ask whether the policy is being put into to meet the pledge. On the action year, ask about how many dollars have dropped in. And we'll then be able to report proactively and objectively about whether we're making progress. Thank you for now. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Blessing. I can't agree more. And we really appreciate your insight and experience in the space around where these pledges could go to if we don't hold them to account and if we don't ask the important questions around implementation. We're running extremely behind schedule, but I'm really also keen to hear from Phoebe. Thank you for joining us and for being here and making the time. And I want to ask, obviously, from the point of view of Power Africa, the organization, how you are focused on access and development, and how does Power Africa view this goal, tripling renewables and energy efficiency? And can I please ask you to kindly keep the your interventions, short if you can, obviously, and then we can conclude the panel. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I really enjoyed listening to the other panelists, and I'm excited to see just how many people have joined today. So you've asked about, how we feel about this race to 2030, and internally at Power Africa, which is an interagency government initiative that was launched under the Obama administration 10 years ago. And we've learned a lot in 10 years, but we have 6 years till 2030, and we're calling it our sprint to 2030. And the way we're looking at access is that we're very concerned about the cost of capital. So we've heard here about the need for subsidies, the unaffordability of renewable resources. And what we're seeing in Africa is, for example, with mini grids, they're double the cost of mini grid systems in other parts of the world. And a lot of those costs are implicated in perceived and actual risks, and the risks that investors see when they come to the African continent. And so a big piece of what we work on at Power Africa through all of our interagency partners is addressing the cost of capital issues. So, for example, through the DFC, we've worked through the delivery of guaranteed products with local banks so that more local banks become familiar with investments in renewables and can, lend in local currency, because local currency helps reduce a lot of those hard currency risks that get introduced and can help drop costs. We're also very interested in the productive use of energy space, and it's a place we've been active now for a couple of years. More recently, we've done an intervention in Liberia where we have delivered through US aid numerous grants to local companies that have then distributed POE resources to fishing communities so that fishermen who often work at night under dangerous conditions can have access to lights, and then through communal efforts have access to storage systems, so cooling systems that allow for better protection of their harvest, so the fish harvest. But we also look at agricultural produce. Many farmers across Africa can lose up to 40% of their harvest due to rotting and issues with supply chains. And so we're looking at ways to bring in more finance to help create a flywheel of sort of economic growth, and that PUE space is a place we want to play a lot in. And then we also come in to reduce the cost of capital for on-grid and off-grid producers of energy. And some of that is through the delivery of legal services, of transaction advisory services. So we have a great example of the Galamati solar and battery installation in Malawi, where we were able to draw on multiple resources across the interagency. So drawing on the Millennium Compact Challenge, delivery of regulatory and policy support in Malawi that led to a public procurement, drawing on DFC concessional finance, USTDA, free of charge feasibility studies, and then bringing in as the top layer USAID transaction advisory assistance to look at ways in which to deploy a battery at scale on grid and first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa. So we try to draw on this, vast array of resources across the interagency to help drive down the cost of capital and provide more access to these innovative programs that can show how battery energy storage systems work, how private infrastructure for transmission can work, how PUE can work. And I think we've done a lot of innovative work in those spaces and hope to continue working and collaborating with our partners on the African continent to make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phoebe. I'm really glad you mentioned the cost of capital reduction for renewable energy projects. This is a big issue and an imperative for the international community and for Africa to solve, especially cost of capital for renewable energy projects impacted by perceived risk, by that credit rating agency system we have currently, where, private sector credit rating agencies that do not have a physical presence in the continent or a current understanding of the African continent rate African sovereign nations, and then leads to that hike of capital cost by investors. So I think that's been a huge political call from the continent, and I hope your organization and the rest in the panel can do something to address this. Colleagues, can I just ask that I'm really keen on everyone addressing the audience one more time, but can I ask, maybe I can ask the entire audience just one question, or the entire panel one question, please keep it 30 minutes. And this was actually a question to John, but I want to have everyone reflect because it's a question around what we're discussing today, climate journalism within the Climate Africa Warsha. And it's relevant to everyone on the call, representing a specific type of stakeholder. So maybe, John, you can start us off, and then I'll pass to the next person on the screen. And please keep it to 30 minutes. But the question is, how do we ensure the quality of the reporting is done in a way that is digestible for the common man? And more importantly, how can this, climate journalism better inform governance and decision-making? And for the rest of the panel, how can, philanthropy, public, civil society or private sector, or your specific organization that you represent do better to ensure media in Africa are better equipped to report on these issues? So John, over to you, 30 seconds kindly, and then I'll pass to the rest. Thank you.
Okay, so the first thing is that a better informed journalist makes a better informed, communicator to the public. So the first thing is obviously for journalists to really read up on what's happening, what the developments are in the climate space, but not just do that. Go a step further, get deepen their source network with experts, politicians, people who are at the negotiating table. The second thing is really to think about the audience and think about communicating in ways that do not oversimplify sometimes complex scientific jargon or complex issues, but communicate them in a way that's simple, clear, and that really goes more towards storytelling. So an investment in storytelling. And I think the third thing is really an investment in the community of the community itself. And by community, I'm using this as shorthand for our audiences and our stakeholders, etc. We have to invite them into our newsrooms and make them part of any discussion that we're looking at in terms of perhaps the storylines that we're pursuing, the projects that we think about, and possibly the people that we interview. I think that right now in a moment where there's very serious lack of clarity around business sustainability for journalism itself, would be three of the ways that I think could help in terms of better communicating these kinds of stories and these kinds of issues.
Thank you, John. McKenna, over to you. Thanks.
I mean, what can I add to John's expertise? But from my point of view, how we could storytell better, I think we talk on sometimes on very specific lines of inquiry. And I think that the issues are so diverse and there's room for discussion on the totality of the issue, right? You don't have to stick to one angle. That sometimes all I read about is carbon, but there's so many success stories, but also challenges around so many other solutions around climate, and not just on mitigation, on resilience, on adaptation, the things that are really, really going to push Africa forward beyond the kind of same story sometimes we tell on us being the victims and all the stories around how we're being affected, but how are we also answering the question of climate, and how could we also lead? I think telling those stories and telling them from a human point of view, I think will be really helpful.
Thank you, McKenna. Thanks for that insight. Phoebe, over to you.
Thanks so much. Look, this is a thing we've worked with, a challenge we've had at Power Africa, which is how do we communicate about the work that we do? So much of it is deeply technical and not easily, sort of captured in a short blog post. And I know we have our head of communications on the line as well, and this is something that she's really focused on, which is how do we get down to stories that really elucidate a number of the challenges we're trying to address? Because what we see with the energy access issue is that it's a wicked problem. there's no clear resolution to a lot of these challenges to delivering energy access to hard to reach communities. And we need to be able to tell stories that help us understand the complexity of what we're facing. And that's something that, you know, we continue to work at Power Africa, is how to tell compelling stories that talk about this whole ecosystem of challenges that we're grappling with.
Thank you very much. I completely agreed. Adenike, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So looking at it from the journalist's point of view, I'm going to say it depends on how you tell the story. Yeah, we know that Africa are the victim here, yes. But then I'm going to address it in the sense of the government angle. We know that government, they are more on the profit side of how to make profit for the whole thing. But then if we could make it compelling in such a way that government could see more profit in it, in terms of job creation that it could give to the young population, and at the same time, it could also be beneficial in total to the people in terms of just investment, not only in just solar, but in other forms of renewable like wind, hydro, and the rest. And so it needs more compelling form of telling those stories. And when it comes to business also, how can they shift? What are the opportunity it gives them if they could shift to renewable energy sources? And so when it comes to community or to the grassroots, is to be able to simplify the terms in the way that they could understand or relate better with it. They understand the fact that there's a problem with the climate, but they don't know where the problem is coming from. And it has to do with also journalists working with civil society for them to know where the problem is, which community is doing more, and which community needs to be spotlighted when it comes to examples on renewable energy, or when it comes to why we need to invest on renewables. And so there are a lot of opportunity or stories that we could tell that could attract people to become use or to make use of renewable energy. And at the same time, just to chip in that if we could invest as much as we have invested in the fossil fuel into the renewable sector, it could have helped us to achieve the lot. And so why we are trying to invest in renewable energy, it could be better if we could also shift those investments in fossil fuel into renewable energy. I think that way it could help us to achieve better and more feasible kind of results that we need, because we can't even wait for 2050. We need to start from now, because by 2050, a lot of crises would have happened. We are seeing the heat wave in Nigeria, the flood in Kenya, and around the world. And we just can't wait. And so all of these kind of stories, when we could tell them of the fact that these are floods happening, these are heat wave, contribution from the fossil fuels, it could help to, make people understand better. And so it all depends on how we tell the story, and the audience that we are telling the stories matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adenike. I want to, a blessing for you, since I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, but the only question we have for the panel is directed to you. So you could obviously reflect on the question I ask, but I also want to read out the question for you. And please, 30 seconds again, we are running immediately out of time and we're losing audience. But the question is blessings to blessings. I love your perspective. The reality today is, however, that the media is often pay for play, which makes objectivity impossible since it's paid coverage, not earned. How do you suggest overcoming this reality? Thank you.
Well, I think we've got to go back to the fundamental values of journalism, which is objectivity. And the same way we're fighting corruption in the arms trades, in all kinds of industries, in government, we've got to take the same values into environmental journalism. But we can only do that if you go back to the basic tenets of journalism, which is the 4 Ws and an H. Now, if you want to be a journalist and be an analyst, you're going to look like you're a paid agent. But I think that we need to go back to industry and go back, particularly those that even the philanthropists, GEAPP, when you receive money from these big industries, you've got to tell them to also put money into independent media development. I mean, there are media fellowships. They must put money into journalism schools without wanting anything in return. That way, the journalist that comes out of, they would not know who the piper is. But the challenge is you go into journalism already knowing who's paying for your journalism and therefore which industry to defend. But I think most importantly, journalists must also really appreciate that they are not lobbyists. I mean, if you enter into a room as a referee and you put on the gloves, don't be shocked when you are caught up on the check. No, so I think that we've got to live by our individuality and we will be protected. But I'm not saying that there are no evil forces out there. We've become the doer or the maker of major profits as the media. And I think that we need to protect ourselves better. But I think that we must also allow collaboratively for other people to fight for Earth's problem. We cannot fight for Earth's problem alone. We are not Avengers. Thanks.
Thank you, Blessing. Thank you so much. What a good way to end the panel. I want to really thank my panel. If we were in a physical panel, I would have asked the audience to give a round of applause, but I really appreciate you coming here and thank you, Blessing. A virtual applause. I really appreciate the time. I want now to move on swiftly to the next part of our session, and the audience will be soliciting a lot of engagement from you now. So with that, David, I want to bring to the virtual stage David Lemayan, the founder and principal of Tenere Research, who will take us through some of the key elements of data-driven reporting. David, may I kindly just pass to you?
Great, thank you, Jabri. Thank you to our panelists. That was fantastic and good to see so many faces here, and of course the Excellency who isn't not here. Of course, John Allen, thank you so much for making the time and everyone. So very quickly, I'm going to make very quick. I think sort of we're going to go through a bit of a interactive session. We've talked quite a bit around what climate looks like and how it can play a part in sort of the kind of reporting that needs to happen and what is the reporting around climate specifically. So I'm going to start. I think somebody is going to help me do the Q&A session, the survey. I'm not sure who's going to do that. Yeah, there we go. All right, so we're going to do a small poll. A lot that reporting on climate and weather is that there's so much data that you have to deal with and handle. These are a few sets of questions, very quick questions. I think there are 4 of them. And what we want to get from you from the participants who are on here and artificial and what are the opportunities. So it's a very quick poll, and we're going to be hopefully seeing some of the comments that are coming in, and we're going to have just a very quick chat about this. So on the first question, so what is your current level of familiarity with artificial intelligence in journalism? Are you really familiar with it, moderately or not? Have you ever used AI tools in your reporting? So put it in the comments if you have. What are some of the potential benefits that you see using AI for climate change and renewable reporting? So is this everything from weather reporting, from being able to track weather patterns or the cyclones? And then, what are the concerns that you have integrating? So these are some of the polls. So if you're able to do that, and I'm going to see if I can see the results right now. Host, okay, great. So I'm just going to check on the polls and the quizzes. Oh, it is my network buffering. Oh, thank you. I'm going to try and change my network if that's an issue. All right. Okay, sorry about that. Let me try and switch my network because I'm guessing you cannot hear me I'm breaking up quite a bit. Yeah. All right, cool. So I don't know how many people have answered the poll. I really cannot see the poll right now, but if you've answered those, please let us know in the comments as well. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Much better. Yes. So if you've answered the poll, please let us know, and then we'll be able to be in touch. Oh, great. Thank you, Zainab. And we'll be able to look at them. So at the end, we'll come back to them and see what people have answered and how they've responded. So otherwise, I want to pass on very quickly to Zainab, who should have joined and is going to be taking us through a very, very quick section. There we go. We have the poll that's ended. But we'll come to Zainab first, and then we'll do the poll responses at the end. So Zainab, I don't know if you're there. Wandati.
David, you can continue
Jabri.
in the meantime. You can continue just with the poll for results for
Oh.
the poll.
Okay, so then let's look at the results for the poll very quickly. So, wow, good responses, great, excellent, out of 20. Okay, so here we're seeing, I think everyone can see this, is that some people are somewhat familiar, most people, and very few are not familiar at all. On the second questions, if people have used AI tools, which is something that we're finding in Kenya as well, quite significantly, is that people are mostly familiar and people are actually using for tools for basic role has closed off. So I'm going to hand over to Zainab Wandati, and we'll see how this goes after the end. Oh, okay, it's come again. Sorry, I think it's my network that's really messy. But anyway, the biggest concern is ethical concerns. So we'll give it over to Zainab Wandati. Really, really good. Thank you everyone for participating, and we'll put this together for you. Thanks, Zainab.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. How is everyone doing? I hope you're all okay. Those in Nairobi or in Kenya, I hope you're safe from the floods and surviving the floods. It's a crazy time to be in Kenya today. And if you're on the East African coast, I also hope you're safe from Cyclone Hidaya, which is also about to hit us. So stay safe. Yeah, so my name is Zainab Wandati. I'm a journalist at the Nation Media Group. I am currently the sustainability editor. I'm a science journalist. I cover environment, climate change, agriculture, everything science, basically. And so for the next little bit, we're going to talk about reporting and how to tell your stories, your climate stories to African audiences, or how to tailor your stories to the various African audiences. So just allow me for a moment to share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Please just put it in full view.
Yeah, that's what I'm about to do. I just need to confirm that you can actually see it first. Okay. Great. So since you can all see my screen, we're going to talk about the power of storytelling in Africa. I've been a storyteller. I've worked with Alanamu before. I've been telling this climate story for more than 12 years now in Africa, mostly Kenya, but also parts of Africa. So I guess maybe that gives me a little bit of authority or confidence to be able to share some of the things I've learned in the field over the years that I've been doing this. So like I said, I'm sustainability editor at the Nation Media Group at the moment. So telling the climate story in Africa, just basically climate storytelling is about telling stories about the climate, telling stories to audiences, stories that resonate with the audiences. For example, Africa suffers a lot of flooding, Africa suffers a lot of drought, Africa suffers a lot of weird weather happening all the time. Like now, the East African region is in an El Nino season, and this El Nino season is exacerbated by climate change. So stories about how people have been impacted by these adverse weather events, how people have been impacted by the flooding, how people have been impacted by the drought. That is what climate storytelling is about. Also stories of solution, how communities are building their resilience to the impact of climate change, building their resilience to the local solutions that they're putting in place in order to adapt to the situation that they find themselves in. So your job as a journalist then becomes, how then do you raise this awareness of climate change, and how do you connect the stories of the people to where they can find solutions or where they can find help? So your responsibilities, you provide the accurate science-based information, because there's a lot of science in climate change. And the thing about science journalism is that there's no guesswork. It's not like political journalism where you can rely on the power of deduction or implication. Like I say something about this politician, and then you say, I assume Zainab meant this. There's no such thing in science. It either is accurate or it is not. So you bring that accurate science-based information. And you also get to highlight the different dimensions of climate change. We'll get into those dimensions later when we talk about the framing of the climate story. But these dimensions here include how the different people are impacted differently. You may all be going through the thing that is called climate change, but how you feel the impacts of climate change is not the same as how somebody in Uganda, Kampala, would feel the impacts of climate change. So those dimensions, or what it means from different communities, from community to community, what it looks like from community to community, from country to country, you have to bring those out in your storytelling. And also you have to bring the policymakers to account. The policymakers would be the government, the parliament. For example, when there's a piece of legislation that's coming into the House that touches on climate change, or that will enable communities, or will affect communities in one way or another in terms of climate change. For example, a legislation has been passed that allows Company X to cut vast acres of forest land in a particular rainforest or in a particular forest, and there's a community living in that forest. What will be the impact of such or on that community? Are the legislators in your country bringing in legislation that will protect communities from the impact of climate change? In the last year, we've seen, the last 2 years, I think, we've seen various communities around the world suing their governments for failing to protect them from the impact of climate change. Now, this is where holding policymakers to account comes in place. In Kenya, I think we've had 2 such cases. We've had one of the most iconic ones was when a community in Lake Baringo region sued the government for failing to protect them from the impacts of the rising lake. They were displaced by the lake. They lost their homes. They've lost their land. They will never return to their homes because those places are now permanently underwater. So how do they get compensated? Who compensates them for this? So they sued the government, and that case is still underway. Does your country have a climate law? Does the climate law benefit the people, or does it benefit the government? Does your country have a carbon legislation? Does it benefit the people? Does it benefit the government? That's how you hold policymakers to account. And also, how do you look into solutions? How do you only ever tell stories of problems, or do you also bring solutions to the table? Solutions are a good way of telling stories. You can highlight a bit of the problem and then say, okay, in order to address this problem, this community is doing this for themselves, and this is how this solution is working. Meanwhile, scientists are also developing this solution, which could offer an even better, and which could work even better for the community. And therefore, when this solution, the scientific solution and the community solution come together, this is how the community benefits. You also have, as a journalist, you also have the role of informing and empowering. Addressing climate change can be a very complicated issue, can be a very complicated matter when you tell stories of climate change. There's a lot of jargon involved, particularly when you're reporting on the big conferences and whatnot. A lot of jargon is involved there. And unfortunately, the audiences trust you to translate this information to them. And one way I often like to tell people to help them break down this information is by thinking about someone in your life that you would like to tell this story to. Just one person, someone specific that you'd like to tell this story to. Could be your mother, could be your father, could be your brother, could be your aunt, your significant other, just one person in your life. And then think about how this person likes to consume information. And then based on that, you're able to then think about your story. So if I tell my story the way I've written it like this, or the way I've prepared my story, if I were to tell this story to this person that I've thought about, the person in my life, how will they take it? How will they take it? Will they understand what I'm saying? Will they feel informed? Do they feel empowered? What do I want them to use this information for after I've told them the story? Do I want them to take action? Is there a call to action in my story? So once you identify that individual, it becomes then easier for you to plan how to tell your story, or what tools to use in telling your story, because you want this person you've identified to be able to fully understand that story. Now, the thing about climate change, telling the climate story in Africa, is that the circumstances that Africa finds itself in are very unique. Africa finds itself in the middle of a crisis it had very little to do with, and yet it has to do something about it. Africa's contribution to global warming is very negligible. Even when you look at the individual countries, very negligible. Yet we suffer some of the worst impacts of climate change, and we lack the resources we need to adapt to this changing climate. And if we fail to adapt, despite our limited resources, if we fail to adapt, our people suffer in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. There are many countries on the continent that are still yet, in fact, even Kenya was just only beginning to recover from the impacts of the drought we just came out of, the worst drought in 40 years. And now here we are in a flooding. Down south in Africa, Southern Africa, now they're in a drought situation. We find ourselves in such a unique position, but we lack the resources we need. And why we find ourselves in this unique situation is, one, we are very vulnerable to climate change ourselves as a continent, where our geographic position as a continent, we find ourselves very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Even within the continent, the impacts of climate change are not the same. We might have the same stories. Our stories might look similar, but experiences vary across countries, across regions. Even within the same country, how one part of the country feels the impact of climate change is not the same as how another part of the country will feel the impacts. For example, when the Horn of Africa was in the drought, and also Kenya was in that drought, this drought hit 23 counties. The arid counties mostly, the arid north particularly. The bulk of the impacts of that drought are felt in the arid north. And this is usually the story every time the country finds itself in a drought. The arid north suffers the greatest impact. Now that we're in the opposite, in the flooding situation, people would not have expected to see Nairobi's flooding to the scale that it is. This flooding have not reached the north yet. So the North is just hearing about the flooding in Nairobi, but they know to prepare themselves, because a lot of times it will flood. Sometimes it will rain this part of Nairobi and then the North floods, not because it rained in the North, but because the water flowed that way. And the rivers that the country has traversed through various parts of the country, so the rivers just overflow. So parts of the country have learned. When you hear it has rained in Nairobi, you brace yourself for flooding, not because it has rained, but because the water will come to you anyway. So our experiences, we have different but common experiences as a continent. We also have limited access to information, and you'll hear our presidents talk a lot about this. Even when we go to the COPs, you'll hear a lot of conversations going on in terms of sharing, technology transfer, and sharing of resources. So this limited access to even technology, to information, is one of the challenges that the continent also suffers. So in a nutshell, the challenges that the continent suffers with drought, agricultural productivity, rising sea levels, and threats to biodiversity. And these are things you've already seen in your countries. These are things you've heard of in your country, and maybe you may not have been able to connect them to climate change, or you may not have connected them to climate change, but they are part of the impacts of climate change. So then, how do you localize the story? How do you localize the story? One thing to remember is that stories are about people. Once you think about it that way, about people, then it becomes easier to begin the process of localizing that story. So even if it's the COP, you've gone to the COP and you're telling the story from the COP, think about people. How am I going to tell this? How am I going to find someone to tell this story about? And how to do that? You could do that through incorporating these four key ways that I've put here on this slide, incorporating indigenous knowledge. One thing you'll find communities telling you is that people have a tendency of assuming that people in the villages know nothing. You assume that because you live in a remote person, this person lives in a remote person, they know nothing. They may not know climate change in the language you know it, but they definitely know something has shifted. You call it climate change in English, but in their language, they know it as something else. They probably use multiple words to describe what's happening. They will tell you it no longer rains when it used to. We no longer can predict the weather. We no longer get a harvest like we used to. The droughts are now worse. The droughts are harsher. Things like that. So one step to localizing the story is to not assume that the communities know nothing. They know something. They know something. So you go to them and then incorporate what they know into your storytelling. And this is through using indigenous knowledge that these communities have, through featuring the local voices. These local voices, you can identify somebody who will be your compelling central character to weave this story around. For instance, if you're telling a story about a drought, find someone who has either lost all of their livestock or lost all of their crops. Or if it's a story about flood, somebody who has lost their entire family, lost their entire crop, their entire farm has been submerged, people like those. And then make them the star of your story. Then you weave the story around them. By making them the star of your story, then you're making them the compelling central character of the story. And then you weave the story around this person. Use of local languages. An example of this at NTV, there's this program we run called Earthwise, which runs on Sundays. It's currently on a production break. But what we do with Earthwise is when we go to the communities to tell their stories, in this section, there's a section in the show we call Climate Voices. So there is where the communities now tell their stories. We allow them to tell the story in their native language. And then what we do is to put subtitles instead of having somebody speak over, because stories are very authentic when they are told in the language that the local voice is most comfortable in. So don't force this person to speak in English. Don't force this person to speak in the national language of your country if that is not the language they're comfortable in. You will get a more compelling story if you allow them to speak in their local language, and then you use subtitles. And in fact, this also will also give you access to audiences in that region of the country when they hear somebody speaking in their own language. Now, and then lastly, the other way to localize a story, you use local solutions, local-based solutions, locally led adaptation methods. They have a greater impact than if you were to bring a foreign solution. Now, how to look out for these solutions? Again, I'll give an example of Kenya. A couple of years back, I think around 2014 there was a 2012, 2014 there was a drought that hit the north. And Red Cross mobilized the country to start a movement, Kenyans for Kenya, raised a lot of money. They sat in the boardroom, decided, what do we do? How do we build the resilience of the people up north? What do we do with this money? And in their wisdom, they decided irrigated agriculture was the best way to go. And they went up north, mobilized the community. They built greenhouses. They did fantastic. The beautiful crops. The crops are beautiful. But now when you go there, there's barely anything left of those greenhouses. And it was a great learning lesson for the country, by the way, that situation, because one key thing that the country learned from that was you can't bring a solution to the community if they did not ask you for that solution. If they did not ask you for that solution. You see, this is a solution that had been designed in the boardroom in Nairobi and taken to a people nearly 1,000 kilometers away. A people who are pastoralists, they're not farmers, they're pastoralists. The land itself is not built for agriculture. It's a pastoral land. A better solution would have been to have a chat with this community and ask them, so given how high the temperatures you get, how do we bring a solution that will be more resilient? And perhaps they would have said they want more resilient livestock, they want more resilient pasture, and they want water sources that never run dry. So find a way to tell a story of how the community itself is addressing its climate problem. Are they digging water pumps? Are they building, there's a word FAO uses to describe those pits, but there are these pits that some communities dig around each crop to give it, it's like about more than 30 centimeters around each crop. And then they just dig it out nicely deep. They mulch it a bit. And then when it rains, that pit is able to hold water for longer than it would if that pit hadn't existed. And therefore it gives the crop a better chance of survival, even in the worst drought. Such local solutions. So what are the elements that you need in your climate story? One, human-centered narratives. Find a local voice, weave your story around.
Hi, Zainab. Really sorry, but if you could conclude in the next few minutes. We are running a bit behind schedule, but I just wanted to flag that. Thank you.
Yes. So find a person to weave your story around. Use visual elements like videos, audios, combine all the tools of multimedia, video, audio, text, and photos into that story. Use data to enrich the story if you need to put out a map and map out where exactly your story you're talking about, how many people are impacted, what are the numbers in that area, and also solutions. Make really good stories. Now, storytelling is about framing. Climate stories don't have to be boring. Climate stories don't have to just be about a drought or a flood. There's so many ways to tell the climate story. But before you begin telling that story, you need to be aware of your personal biases, because your personal biases always show when you're telling the story. For example, if you're a climate denier and you're telling a story about climate change, believe me, that denialism will show up in that story. So always be aware of your personal biases before you start telling that story. How can you make this story about health? Right now with the flooding, the health impacts would be the waterborne diseases that are coming up as a result of the flooding. The health impact would be what are the new crop diseases that are coming up? What are the new animal diseases that are coming up as a result of climate change? Malaria is evolving. Malaria is moving to areas it didn't exist before. Food security, what is the impact on crop production? This is usually the most, we say, the most told stories about climate change are usually about food production and food security. But there's also the economic impact. People care when you tell them about how their money will be impacted. For example, this tomato that you used to buy maybe 4 months ago, you used to buy it at $5. No, $5 is a lot for tomato. Maybe you used to buy it at $1. And now you've come 4 months down the line, you're buying it at $3. Why? You trace it back to where that tomato came from. Maybe the farms where those tomatoes come from were hit by a drought, and the vast majority of that tomato or that tomato crop died out. Politics is about the legal framework. The COP itself is a very political environment, and I already mentioned the laws that your parliament or your legislators are bringing to the table. So there's also a political way to look at the climate story. The climate story also causes a significant security crisis because of the refugees, intercommunity conflicts, farmers and pastoralists fighting. Pastoralists are moving in search of water and pasture, and then they end up crossing into farming territory, and a conflict arises. Look into the intercommunity conflict in your countries. Is there a climate issue as an underlying factor. How is climate change eroding cultures? Pastoralists being forced to abandon their way of life in order to become farmers because of climate change, or because their system, their lands are too hot now, they can no longer support the livestock that they have, pasture no longer survives. This slide just talks about if you are to infuse a traditional lens into the story, how would you do it? Blend the modern with tradition, focus on the community, draw on oral tradition. You can use your own community, the things that happen in your own community to find a climate story to tell from your own community. Some of the digital tools you can use to tell your story, particularly when you're doing data visualizations or when you are editing the software, Data Wrapper, some of these softwares are freely available. Flourish can help you put data together. You've compiled data and you don't know how to draw the analysis. Just input them into these softwares, and then the software can do the cross-referencing for you, and then you begin to see how it looks. There are also tools you can use to give you prompts on how to build a story. Tools such as Story Map can tell you how to build the stories. And many of them are free, so you can also begin interacting with them and see how you can build a story around them. And that is where I'd like to end it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zainab. I really appreciated your insight and for you joining us. I remember when we met in Glasgow the first time, and you were very generous with reporting some of the issues that were going on and connecting. So it's good to reconnect, and thank you for joining us. I also want to thank David for his introduction to data-driven reporting and facilitating that that Q&A and that survey. And now I will, for closing, I know we are over time, but now I'll pass on to Mimi Kalinda, Global Comms expert and Group CEO and co-founder of ACG. Mimi, thank you for closing for us, and I'll pass to you now.
Thank you so much, Jabri. I think I just want to say, first of all, just a big, big thank you to all of our media colleagues that joined us today, our communications experts. I think it's been very clear. One of the things that His Excellency Professor Osinbajo said earlier that really stuck with me is that the media plays three roles. He said, we are explainers, we are amplifiers, and we're also actors. I really believe that climate action and getting to the changes that we're all seeking as far as climate change is concerned is going to take all of us, but the media plays an absolutely critical role. And so the fact that you've taken the time to join us today on the World Press Freedom Day is incredible, and thank you so much. I think I just wanted to say that this is the beginning of a conversation. There's still a lot more to say. I think we've had so many insights, so much data that's been shared, and so much rich information and content that we'd really like to see this continue in the future. Annette said earlier on that we hope to make this a quarterly conversation, but it's not just us leading the conversation. I think it's very important that everybody on this call, number one, give us feedback. We're going to have a survey that comes up, so please stay for 2 to 3 minutes at the end of this so that you can take that survey. But most importantly, follow us on social media, on the GEAPP website. There'll be so much more that is posted in the coming days, and we'd like to hear from you so that we can shape this conversation. We're trying to create a community here, a community of sharing, a community of empowering one another, but also a community of action. So if you can share with us what it is that you'd like to talk about. We had the session earlier on with David around AI. Zainab has done an incredible job on storytelling. There's so much more that we can deconstruct and unpack together, and we'd really like to get more insights from you. So on that note, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody who's joined once again. GEAPP, the work that this organization is doing is really, really impacting lives. As Zainab said earlier, At the end of the day, the heroes of our story are the people who are being impacted each and every single day by climate change. And so thank you to GEAPP, thank you to Annette, and also thank you to all of our partners, Power Africa. Thank you, John Allen, and our wonderful panelists who jumped on here and shared great insights. And also thank you to the ACG team, who worked behind the scenes to make sure that this worked out seamlessly from the very, very beginning. This has been a work in progress, and we look forward to having more of these conversations. And thank you to you, Jabri, as well, for your time and for your seamless facilitation of this important conversation. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Mimi, as well. I appreciate your comments, and thanks to everyone and to the panel and to the professor. Thank you.
Jabri, you're on mute, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just want concluding. Thank you, Mimi, for those concluding remarks. I want to thank my panel. I want to thank the professor. I want to thank you, Zainab, David, and Annette, and the GEAPP team for convening us, and obviously to you participants. Thank you all, and we will definitely stay in touch with all of you. Or as well as please fill in that quick 15-second survey that's popping up on your screen. It is just 3 prompts and it's a multiple choice. So please fill that in and be, as honest as possible. We welcome all viewpoints. Thank you. And we will close, I guess, at 2:05 Kenya time. So once the minute ends and people have filled that in, we can close. So just look at your screen. If maybe you are on another screen, look at the Zoom screen, you'll see something pop up. Cool. And the tech team can let me know if majority has filled it in, and we can close in case that happens before the minute. Great. We're at the minute mark. So I think everyone would have filled this in by now. Thank you again, everyone. 12 out of 37 people have filled it in, but I guess we have to close now. I think we've lost some people. Thank you all. We'll stay in touch. This is it's a growing process, a continuing process, and hopefully we'll convene everyone again very soon. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day and your weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Jabri.
Thank you, everyone.